Alright, so I'm going to do a video on finding the axis of symmetry for a quadratic. And I've actually started with one already, and it's y equals x squared plus x minus 6. And nice because if you take a look at the graph here, you'll see that it's actually symmetric on the line x equals -1. So if I type in x equals -1, nope, that's not true. It's x equals -1/2. There we go. What I'm hoping you can see is that -1/2, when x equals -1/2, the minimum point is at -6.25. Now, that's nice if you're using a graphing calculator and you have access to that. But how do you find it if you don't? And that's what I'm going to show you now. There's two ways of doing it. First, I'm going to factor and use a formula. And so here I would say, well, I'm going to factor to find the, bless you, I'm going to factor to find the intercepts. So I'm going to set it equal to 0. I'm going to say, well, this is x plus 3 times x minus 2, which equals 0. So therefore, x plus 3 equals 0, or x minus 2 equals 0. Subtract 3 from both sides. Add 2 to both sides. And these are the x-intercepts. And if I go back to my graph, here's -3, and here's +2. And you can see that's where the graph crosses the x-axis. However, if we want to find the actual turning point, I would use this formula, x equals -b over 2a. And it's not a hard formula to remember because you should already know x equals -b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a, which really means if you get rid of all of this, the plus or minus b squared minus 4ac all over 2a, you are only left with that. So here I'm going to plug it in. X equals -1 over 2 times 1, which is -1 over 2, which is x equals -1/2. Well, if we plug -1/2 in to our function, we'd get a -1/2 squared plus a -1/2 minus 6. Well, 1/2 squared is 1/4 minus a half minus 6. Well, if you have 1/4 minus a half, let's see, that's really 2/4, so that's really -1/4. So you're going to end up with, I ran out of room. I'm going to erase a little bit of this. You're going to end, well, you're going to end up with -6 1/4. And once again, if I go back to my Desmo screen and take a look, there it is, -6 1/4. However, there is one other method that you can use, and I want to show that here. And it's using completing the square. Now, a lot of people don't like completing the square, but it does have something that's actually kind of neat. And I'm going to show you this. My a is 1, my b is 1, and so my b over 2 is 1/2, and my b over 2 squared is 1/4. Now remember, that's what I'm going to add to both sides to complete the square. And now that I've done that, I can now write my perfect square binomial, which is x plus 1/2 quantity squared equals 6 1/4. And I'm not going to change this. Remember, 6 1/4 is really equal to 25/4 because 6 times 4 is 24, plus 1 is 25. So I'm going to rewrite this as 25 over 4. I'm going to take the square root of both sides. And when I do that, you have to remember that this becomes plus or minus. Now the reason why this is nice is because this becomes x plus 1/2 equals plus or minus, well, the square root of 25 is 5, and the square root of 4 is 2. If I now subtract 1/2 from both sides, I get x equals negative 1/2 plus 5/2, or x equals negative 1/2 minus 5/2. And this will give you x equals 4/2, which is 2, or x equals negative 6/2, which is negative 3. And if you look, those are the roots that we found before. Now, we weren't really looking for the roots before, so I am going to back up a few steps. Actually, that's not sure. I'm going to back up a lot of steps. I hope you have this all written down. Oh, goodness me. They won't even let me back up that far. All right, that's fine. All right, so here's what I'm going to do. Erase all this. Now I'm going to go back to here. And that was 25/4. Now, actually, I am going to leave that as 6 1/4, and you'll see why in a moment. If I subtract 6 1/4 over to the both sides, I get x plus 1/2 squared minus 6 1/4 equals 0. And what I'm hoping you notice is this. This tells me that my parent function, which is a parabola, this point here, my vertex, should go over should go left 1/2 unit, and down 6 1/4 units. And like I said, you can do that by completing the square, but once you get to here, you then bring this side over. It's a little bit trickier when a doesn't equal 1, but we'll talk about that later. I hope this video has been helpful. It's kind of confusing, it's a little bit tricky, but do your best and take down notes and ask questions.